Now, the dispute between the City of Cape Town and the SA Human Rights Commission over the care of homeless people in the city is in court today. Last month, a court order barring monitors from the Commission from entering the now closed Strandfontein shelter was set aside. The city will now have to respond to allegations of poor conditions at that centre while it was operating. Let's get you the latest on the story now. We're joined via our Zoom line by attorney Bronwyn Pithey, who is with the Women's Legal Centre. Bronwyn, good morning. Thanks very much for your time. I mean, we know the importance of monitoring shelters not only during COVID-19, but at all times, particularly when it comes to the care of women and children living in those shelters. Just take us through why the court deemed it was necessary for the Women's Legal Centre to be admitted as a friend of the court.
So just to clarify that the Women's Legal Centre has been admitted as an amicus or a friend of the court in this matter, which is essentially a dispute between the City of Cape Town and the South African Human Rights Commission.
Yeah.
The City of Cape Town has brought an application to INTERDICT monitors who were appointed by the South African Human Rights Commission to monitor any potential violations of human rights during the lockdown, both under level 5 and level 4, and obviously continues in the level 3. So the dispute is between those two parties, and the Women's Legal Centre applied to be admitted as an amicus in the matter to bring a gendered lens to the issue in terms of looking at the importance of monitoring in situations where people have effectively been deprived of many of their rights during lockdown, which the average person obviously in the country has also experienced. But specifically vulnerable people, such as people who have chosen to live on the streets or homeless people who've now found themselves being placed in these shelters in terms of the regulations under the lockdown, where we believe that because they are particularly vulnerable, there needs to be a very specific focus on ensuring that their rights are at all times, the rights that remain are in place. And simply because rights have been reduced to some extent doesn't mean that there is an absolute negation of all rights. So we found it absolutely essential that South African human rights monitors who have been appointed by the South African Human Rights Commission maintain their role as monitors to ensure that people's rights are constantly vindicated.
No, absolutely. And it's worrying, isn't it, that the City of Cape Town, even at the beginning, even though the Strandfontein shelter has now closed, but it's worrying that it brought this interdict against the SA Human Rights Commission, preventing monitors from going there.
Yeah, well, I think that's really what our concern is what is really behind the city's concern in their reluctance to allow monitoring to happen. Obviously, if you speak to the city, and certainly on their legal papers that have been placed before court, they give numerous reasons as to why they have brought this interdict, amongst which they argue that the monitors have been incorrectly appointed in terms of law. And secondly, the main thrust of their argument, or one of the main thrusts of their argument, is that the monitors were effectively in contradiction or were breaking the lockdown regulations themselves in terms of wanting access to the Strandfontein site. And on that basis were effectively promoting is the wrong word, but effectively would be part of potentially spreading the virus if they were allowed in and out of the shelter.
Yeah, and just giving us a sense of how the Women's Legal Centre came to be involved in the case, the sad irony of it is that you were wanting to provide a gender lens and you were in fact getting involved because a woman at that shelter had been raped.
Yeah, so I think that's important in terms of the voice that we bring to the matter. We're actually the only party to the matter that is bringing literally a voice of a person who was a resident at the shelter. It's a very, very sad situation which happened. This is not a theoretical argument in terms of us saying that women need to be placed in these shelters with very specific protective mechanisms in place. This is not a theory. A woman was raped at Strandfontein, and that woman is represented by the Women's Legal Centre. Her rights have been violated at the centre, and we continue to protect her rights going through the criminal justice system and any other civil matter which may arise out of it.
Yeah.
So what we were asking from the city at the time, before the litigation even started, at the time of the raid, is what is the city doing, putting in place to ensure that women and other vulnerable groups are safe in places like this. It's not enough to say, oh, well, we have safety and security on site. You know, the United Nations is very clear in the guidelines that they put out that one has to be very cognizant of particular issues and particular needs of vulnerable groups when you set up shelters of this nature or camps of this nature. You have to put plans in place that are very specific and particular and peculiar to the needs of vulnerable groups. And you have to specifically address the very real aspect of violence against women in these situations. And in our opinion, the city simply hasn't come to the table in that regard. We've asked constantly, a number of times, for a plan, exactly what their plan constitutes, and they simply haven't provided one.
I mean, Bronwyn, one would imagine that that kind of thing, exactly what you're talking about now, that there needs to be clear guidelines around how vulnerable groups, including women, are housed at shelters like this. You would think that that would go without saying, that that would be part and parcel of how that kind of plan is implemented.
Well, that's what we would expect, and we would certainly expect that South Africa, which is a signatory to a number of United Nations protocols, would comply with international standards. And the city, interestingly enough, recently submitted extra papers, additional papers in this matter, and they specifically say in those matters that they are not bound by those international guidelines, which we find quite extraordinary, that the city believes that they are beyond the jurisdiction of an international body such as the United Nations. I'm not quite sure why they feel that they aren't, seeing that the Constitution is very clear that we do comply with international law, especially when we are signatories to certain protocols.
Bronwyn,
so that was a bit confusing.
Yeah, absolutely, for me as well, as I'm listening to you saying that. But let me ask you this. So the woman who was raped at the shelter, she's since been moved to a shelter for abused women, and that was thanks to an activist in the community there. But what would have happened if no one had intervened, if that issue had not come to light, if her rape had not come to light?
Well, I mean, look, I mean, the situation is, in terms of her own volition coming forward to report the matter. You know, I mean, without having to go into any of the details of the incident, in terms of protecting her, you know, there were people in the camp that were concerned about her, and that's how the matter came to light. I have no doubt that, you know, I mean, in fairness to the city, once the matter came to light, they did provide an ambulance in terms of taking her to a healthcare facility. But my concern is that, and our concern is that there were not specific reporting mechanisms at the site at the time. We don't believe that the way that it was dealt with at the site, she was removed from the site. There probably should have immediately been the specialist unit, the FCS unit, should have been called from the police, and those things weren't in place. So really the services that she received that night were really activated by, we say, a network of activists who were connected to the site.
Bronwyn, I want to ask you just very quickly before we let you go. So the city is now saying this case in court today is actually pointless because that Strandfontein shelter is now closed. But it's important not only for the Human Rights Commission to get clarity on whether they do have the right to monitor homeless shelters, but also, do you reckon that the court will rule on the issues you've just talked about, that kind of infrastructure to deal with someone who is raped, to deal with vulnerable groups, including women, being housed at these shelters? Do you hope that the court will also say something about that?
We really do hope that the court will address that. That's not the relief that is before the court in terms of what's being asked by, because it's very specifically around the INTERDICT, and that's really like events kind of overtook the situation. And we're hoping to be able to take these matters forward anyway, potentially in another matter, where we want these standards to be recognized as essential to be put in place at shelters of this nature as we go forward, because these shelters will continue to exist in terms of the regulations under the lockdown. So those things are absolutely essential. We're obviously hoping that the court will at least address it and acknowledge that those things are important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure we'll speak to you as well as the case continues in court. Thanks very much for your time this morning. Bronwyn Pithey is an attorney at the Women's Legal Centre, the City of Cape Town, and the SA Human Rights Commission in court this morning. The Human Rights Commission is arguing that they are allowed to let monitors go and inspect sites like that Strandfontein homeless shelter that was set up in the midst of the pandemic in the Western Cape.